our presenters today. We do encourage questions, discussion during this program. We'll just ask that you go ahead and put it in the chat. While we're going through the presentation, you'll locate that chat button likely at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a computer, it might be at the top if you are on a tablet or mobile device. So anytime you want to ask a question, make a comment, please go ahead and put it in there, and our presenters will adjust those as we go. And then hopefully we'll have some additional time for questions and discussion at the end of the program. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Felicia Williamson, Director of Library and Archives, and Dr. Sarah Abosh-Jacobson, our Chief of Education.
Well, thank you so much, Annie, and we're so glad all of you are able to join us today. Sarah and I are going to start out by giving an overview of Liberation. Sarah's going to take that on, and then I'll share some of our most special Liberation artifacts and photographs. And we hope you'll enjoy. I'm going to share my screen and then let Sarah get started explaining Liberation writ large.
Okay, oh, there we go. Wonderful. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Felicia had decided to give a talk on our archival holdings relating to all things liberation. And when we were talking about it, we decided that it would be a good opportunity not only to highlight our archival collections or aspects of our archival collections, but to talk more generally about what is meant by liberation. And that seems like a very simple question, you know, okay, you were enslaved, or you were occupied, or you were incarcerated, and now you're free. That's liberation. It's not really, unfortunately and fortunately, I guess, that simple, because nothing dealing with human beings is really simple. When you deal with human beings, you deal with all kinds of different conditions. You deal with tremendous nuance. You deal with cultural differences, religious differences, ethnic differences, political differences in this case, and economic differences. And we'll touch upon all of those in the next 2 to 3 minutes, because I'm going to do liberation while standing on one foot. This is the quick down and dirty liberation. So the first thing I think that a lot of people think about when they think about liberation in World War II is liberation of the death camps. That in fact is a very, very small part of what's meant by liberation. And really the only 2 death camps that were officially liberated were Majdanek, which was liberated in July of '44 by the Soviets. It was the administrative camp for the 3 Operation Reinhardt death camps. And so that camp was liberated. And the other camp that was liberated was Auschwitz. And Auschwitz was liberated on January 27th, 1945, also by the Soviets. However, in addition to those 2 death camps that were liberated, and the others were not liberated because they had already ceased operations by the time that the Allied troops came to those areas, the concentration camps were liberated across Europe. The liberations of the concentration camps started in '44, and they continued through to May of '45. The camps that were to the east, so Eastern Europe heading westward, were almost entirely liberated by the Soviets. The camps that went from Central Europe to the west were almost entirely liberated by the British and US troops. And these would be the camps whose names you have heard, Dachau and Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen and Mauthausen and all of these really, really large camps. And in liberating those camps, a combination of Jews and non-Jews who were still alive in these camps were given their freedom. Although freedom for people who had been worked almost to death and starved almost to death and suffered all kinds of disease and other issues at the hands of the Nazis didn't necessarily mean anything, because many of these people didn't survive more than a few days after liberation. So that's liberation in Europe from the Baltic states, so Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and Ukraine, which is not Baltic, but those are the 4 easternmost areas where there were concentration camps, and then it goes all the way almost to the Atlantic. But liberation means, as we said, other things to other people. So in the case of Europe, in Western Europe, you're looking at civilian populations that are liberated as well, because they've largely been occupied by the Nazis. And so they have to go about recreating their lives and getting their lives back. Additionally, you have to look at the peoples of Eastern Europe who are now without their Nazi occupiers, but instead have been occupied by the Soviets. And the Soviets, let's keep in mind, are operating a full-blown gulag system throughout Siberia, deep in the Soviet Union, and those gulags are essentially concentration camps. And so many of the Soviet troops and POWs who had been in the West, who are sent back to the East, are met not as conquering heroes, but are met as traitors to Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, and communism more generally, because they've been tainted by the West, and they are shipped up to the Gulag. So that's liberation for them. We need to also look at what happens in the Pacific, because we generally focus on Europe because of the Holocaust, but in the Pacific there are islands that are being liberated. There was hard and heavy fighting throughout the 40s to liberate these islands, and in the cases of some of these formerly Japanese islands, when they were liberated by US Marine forces, the civilians who were on these islands, and I'm thinking of the island of Saipan as an example, choose to jump off the cliffs and commit suicide from the peaks of these island chains, which are mostly they're the tops of underground mountains, and some are underground volcanoes, rather than submit to US rule or conquest. The Japanese home islands, same thing. There is a sense amongst many of the Japanese that they are going to fight to the bitter end, that the United States is going to have to invade the Japanese islands. Truman makes a decision that he can save 1 million American lives, soldiers' lives, and many, many more Japanese lives by using the atomic bombs. He goes on, as you know, to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so liberation, so-called, for the Japanese in those areas takes on the face of mass death and radiation sickness for almost a couple 100,000 people. Additionally, Africa and Asia mark liberation a little longer, so not just 1945, but the fallout from this giant world war is marked by Western decolonization, ultimately by independence throughout, much of Africa and Asia, but it's also marked by the rise of Marxist and communist regimes and takeovers in many areas. And then finally, in America, the war is ended, and liberation in Europe and ultimately liberation in Japan is marked by mass celebrations, the welcoming home of our troops, who are basically told, you know, okay, war's over, boys and girls. Of them, there's not a lot of women who were involved. Get on with your lives, and it marks a period of tremendous growth and prosperity, economic prosperity in the United States, at least for whites who come back from Europe, although even then you have to define what you mean by white, and this is not that conversation. But be aware of the fact that some of the things that came with liberation, like the GI Bill, which were in many ways rewards for a job well done and for service well done, did not apply to African American troops who came back. They couldn't access these kinds of rewards. And the final thing I would point out is that in the case of Western Europe, unlike the United States, the war ended, but the deprivations of war did not end for many of them for a decade or more after the war, from England all the way across Western Europe on the continent. They continued to have to deal with rationing, with shortages for all kinds of things, with a tremendous influx of returning demobilized troops and for whom they did not have jobs. So they did not have the immediate economic success that we had in the United States. The other thing I would say about liberation is, because this is the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the camps, is that in the United States, we had 36 different US liberating divisions. It's at the divisional level that liberation is recognized. By that I mean that it's at the level of units that were around 15,000 men each. And those 36 represented slightly less than half of the total number of divisions that were involved in one way, shape, or form that that were activated for World War II, which is 91 American divisions. There's more to say, but I'll chime in as Felicia begins to go through her description of our archival holdings. But I just wanted to give you kind of a tour of the horizon, that liberation can mean something as specific as the day American troops walk into a concentration camp and tell the Jewish and other inmates, "You're free," to all of these other connected developments, all begun on the day that those begin to be opened up. So, Felicia.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. And you can see why I begged Sarah to join me for this talk, so she could give that overview. From the archival standpoint, as the Director of Library and Archives, my interaction with these challenging histories begins when a family contacts me about a collection they think they might have, that they think might be museum worthy, and then we have that conversation. I can share with you the #1 call, percentage-wise, that I receive these days is from the children and grandchildren of liberators. So by far, in our community here in North Texas, the most frequent call I get about materials that could be a fit for our collection comes from the families of, as you can imagine, recently deceased GIs. There were quite a few people involved in the war effort, as Sarah shared, and a lot of them brought back meaningful items to them, and now family members are not sure what to do with them, and that's where I get involved. So I selected quite a few artifacts to share with you today that show a lot of the different aspects of liberation, both from the liberator point of view. We have this evocative image of soldiers kissing nurses in the street and celebrating and confetti as we won the war, all the way to an image of the liberated and what that meant for them. And it's really quite different. And we try to thread the needle on that in the museum core exhibit, just trying to remind people that, yes, it was victory and celebration, but the other side of that was huge loss for really almost everyone alive in the world had a direct loss during this war. And then when you add the pain of the Holocaust, where some families lost hundreds of family members, and they emerged from these camps not knowing who was alive, not knowing if their family home was still standing or if it was occupied, that large question mark that loomed over these families or these survivors really for sometimes the entirety of their life, and certainly several years following liberation. Liberation started a process for these folks. And then just on a lighter note, my favorite, factoid about rationing after the war is that Queen Elizabeth II had to save ration coupons to get her wedding dress. And people all over Britain sent in their hoarded ration coupons for textiles, and then the government decided that Elizabeth couldn't use them, that it wouldn't be right. But I think that's so interesting to think about. Even the Queen of England couldn't buy a wedding dress because textiles were rationed, and that was 1947. And of course, we know that that rationing went on into the 50s, and those deprivations were long lasting. With that, I'm going to start showing you some of our artifacts. So this you know, there's not a ton of photos in our collection that document liberation, but overall in the world, there are lots of photos of World War II GIs, of the camps, and I'm sharing a selection from our collection today. What's interesting to me about this is that almost every soldier had a little camera. The biggest struggle they had was finding film. Film was was created by companies that had other things on their minds for the war effort. They were using chemicals that became in short supply. But almost every GI took photos, brought home photos. And of course, if they were part of a liberating division, they took photos of those camps because, you know, as Eisenhower said, we need proof. That's Eisenhower, right? I got that right? Okay, good. So this is a liberator, Thomas de Aquino, and he's standing on the beach in Italy, and he ended up working with the Rainbow Division as they liberated Dachau. And I think Sarah did a little research on his story, so I'll let her jump in with that.
So he's an interesting guy. He was born in 1919. So by the time he was drafted, I think, or drafted / enlisted, he was 24. So he wasn't one of the younger boys to go over, although they use the boys as the term for troops generally. He, as Felicia said, was involved in the liberation of Dachau. He grew up in New Jersey, and he gave testimony in the 1990s when he was in his late 70s. He's since passed away, to the Shoah Foundation, and it's wonderful testimony. By that point, he has white hair, a snow white mustache, and just the thickest New York, New Jersey accent you've ever heard. And he does everything from talk about conditions in the military, where he said there was no racism, there was no ethnicism, there was no, it was very interesting because we know for a fact that that's just not true. He said nobody saw anything but the uniform, and we were all together as one, even though there were no black troops in my unit. Fine, that was his sense of it. And he talks in detail about what he saw when he liberated Dachau. And it's clear this is a man who's 78 or 79 when he gives his testimony, that he was shaken to his core by this. And he spent the rest of his life thinking about it and mulling it over, and using it really in many ways as a lens through which he viewed the world. So it's a good way to get a sense that, you know, this may be, you know, he looks like a young carefree guy, you know, doing the beefcake pose. This, since he's in Italy, this is before he gets up to Dachau. But appearances notwithstanding, things are about to change dramatically for him.
Well, and to echo what you're saying, Sarah, I think in what I've seen of liberator testimonies, even if the liberation experience, meaning liberating a camp as opposed to following your division as it lands during the invasion of Normandy and goes all the way through the Battle of the Bulge and makes its way eastward on the race to Berlin, all of those experiences, if they liberated a camp, that was a standout moment. And of course you can, during these interviews, the interviewer is often trying to get them to reveal the impact, and sometimes they're not able to enunciate it, but there's a definite impact, and it, as you said, changes worldviews. And a lot of these guys didn't know what they were signing up for when it came to seeing those camps, and there's a lot of shock involved. And again, that's why a lot of them saved mementos of that experience, because it was so meaningful. Okay. This photo I thought was interesting because you can see there's a U.S. GI who's working as an MP guarding the camps. What's interesting about liberating the camps is many of the camps, you don't think about it, at least I didn't. The camps are liberated either by the U.S. or the Russians or the British. And then a lot of them are immediately turned into displaced persons camps. And so in my mind, I think liberation, the inmates walk out. Well, of course, many of them were too ill to leave the camps. There was a lot of disease, so there was an effort to isolate people in those camps to protect the general population from rampant disease, and then to start rehabilitation. So a lot of medics got involved quickly. We'll talk about that later in our talk. And then they had to find out what to do with these folks. So it started really a second phase of incarceration. Although they were free, there wasn't really a great place for them to go from there. So this guy is guarding the camp. So he's not SS, he's not going to abuse or beat or shoot or kill the inmates there, but he's still guarding the camp. This is Alzariner. He's a really interesting character. Here he is inside a camp he helped liberate, and he's 19 or 20. And he went on to be involved in founding our museum, and Sarah did some interesting research on him as well.
Yeah, so Al Turner was born in Frankfurt in 1924. He came to the United States in 1938 as an immigrant to the US, and he was drafted during the war, and he was sent to Fort Ritchie, Maryland, where he was trained as a Ritchie boy, meaning because of his firsthand knowledge of German culture, language, literature, and behavior, he was trained for intelligence work, meant to be sent back to Europe when we the Americans invaded, and he obviously is an American by this point, and to help interrogate high value targets in the field using his cultural knowledge and his German knowledge. He liberated Dachau, and when I say liberated, he says, excuse me, not Dachau, Buchenwald, I'm sorry. And when I say that, what I mean is that he was there the day after the first American troops walked through the gates of the camp. And I just wanted to read to you something from his testimony that he gave to the museum several years ago, and he also has since passed away. And those of you who've been through the museum will recognize this photo because it's in the photo montage at the end of the Holocaust showing. So he says about liberation of Buchenwald: "It was probably the grimmest day that I have ever experienced. The ovens were still smoldering, the crematoriums. There were bodies that were stacked sky high. The smell was atrocious. The living were skin and bones, people with eyes that were 10 times the size they should be. We were a team of 5 agents. They called us intelligence agents, and one of us, our captain, knew an all West Point colonel who was the armored division that liberated that camp." So that's the connection. He went to the colonel, his captain, Cherner's captain, and said, "Why don't you call Ike Eisenhower? He was down in Frankfurt, not far from where we were." But anyway, this colonel was a fellow graduate with Eisenhower from West Point, and he called him in Frankfurt and said, "Ike, you've got to come up here. You won't believe what you will see here." And Eisenhower's reply was, "Oh, you're just falling victim to all that propaganda that you read in the papers these days about concentration camps." Note, this may be apocryphal. I can only take him at his word. We don't have evidence that this conversation necessarily happened. Plausible, not necessarily probable. He absolutely didn't believe it. When the colonel convinced him to come, he, Eisenhower, and Patton came up to see us. We walked in back of them. I mean, we had free reign because we were not infantry or with a particular group that was controlled by army officers, because they were the small intelligence group. We were the intelligence unit that walked into this camp. And Eisenhower and Patton could not believe what they saw. And then he talks about Eisenhower bringing in video cameras to film all of it. And then he ends his remarks about the liberation of Buchenwald by saying, "And that was when the world really began to believe and find out about all the atrocities that occurred. That was probably the most horrendous moment of my life." So again, these stay with these guys for the rest of their lives.
Well, and I'll just jump in and say, we know from our reading about the Ritchie boys that a lot of them had family members still in Europe that they hadn't heard from, that they were hoping to have the opportunity to go find. So for them, I think for any GI, that would have been a very powerful experience. For a Ritchie boy, it would have been kind of next level powerful to see the realities of camp life. And some of these guys, some of these Ritchie boys in particular, had been in camps themselves. before they escaped as refugees, later to be drafted into the Army. Here's an interesting photo. Here's 3 GIs outside of Dachau. This is in, I think, late 45, because it's been turned into a prisoner of war enclosure, or PW, or I'm sorry, a displaced persons camp, being managed by the Allies at this point. But I thought this photo was interesting because, first of all, it's a winter scene, so we know it's later, and the guys are posing in their full uniforms. This is an interesting photo. Sarah, why don't you take a moment to talk about Rudy, since you got to know him a little bit.
So, no, actually, I didn't. He passed.
Oh, did he?
away.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. I'm sorry.
A couple of years before I got to Dallas, and I'm really sorry I didn't get to know him. Rudolfbaum was born in 1915 in Frankfurt, also a German Jew. He made it to the U.S. in '36 and was either inducted into the Army or joined the Army in June of '41. He ultimately also was selected for Fort Ritchie, Maryland training. He became a Ritchie boy. His specialty was propaganda. Felicia has a magnificent propaganda collection, some of which was material that was dropped by our side over German lines toward the end of the war that he was integral in helping with. Some of it was stuff that he picked up along the way. That's
well,
for
and
another,
bless him, you know, archivists love a good hoarder. It's excellent news, as you know, so he did some good work in just stashing a lot of really interesting propaganda away and then donating it to us.
Yeah. So Rudy was involved in the liberation of Buchenwald, and what you see here is Rudy as an elderly man. And this is a photo that lived in the opening area of our old museum. And Rudy, as an elderly man living in Dallas, is pointing to Rudy, the military policeman, the MP at Buchenwald at the time of liberation. He's got his hands on his hips there. He's got a cigarette butt in his right hand, because what else do soldiers do? Smoke them if you got them at that time. And what you're looking at under Rudy's arm are German civilians who have been brought in from the surrounding area to essentially be forced to look at their handiwork. I mean, this was the sentiment of our troops at that time.
This is another Ritchie boy. We've really just been discovering more and more Ritchie boys in our collection, and this is a new acquisition. The Reese collection came in 2018. I worked with the family to acquire this collection, and Ernest, again, a German Jewish refugee. His parents were in camps when he left for the US, and part in the back of his mind the entire time when he was in the occupation force was trying to find his mother. His father died in the camp, and his mother, he didn't know where she was or how to find her, but in this photo he sends to her in August 1945, and he managed to find his mother. She survived. He managed to help her immigrate to the United States. Pretty amazing story. And so here he is sending this photo of himself as proof of life and that he's coming to find her, and he did reunite with her. It's really beautiful. And, you know, I think that's one of the most interesting things to think about. You're a refugee, you've fled Nazi aggression, you find yourself back on German soil, looking often in the face of Nazis, whether they're in the Wehrmacht or you've happened upon a little band of SS, and in the back of your mind, you're thinking, you maybe probably killed my family. I mean, that's impossible to imagine, really. Here's another haunting photo of a liberation scene. This is a GI named Stephen Bodner, taken by a photographer and liberator named John Manning. And you can see this is it's a rough photo, both because of its composition, because you see stacks and stacks of bodies in the background, but also the photo is fairly damaged. So this is the best scan we have, but it's pretty powerful photo, really, showing the impact in real time of happening upon these kinds of scenes. This is another kind of unusual story about liberation. This is Martin Donald. And so he left after Kristallnacht. A lot of, if they could, Kristallnacht was a big impetus to get out. If people were on the fence, the bare aggression that family saw during Kristallnacht, including mass incarceration of Jews in camps, especially young men, that became a big push to escape if you were able to. And so a lot of these Ritchie boys left in 1938, and then immigration became increasingly hard, and by 1939 it was almost impossible. But Martin Donald left after Kristallnacht and ended up in London. Eventually he was held as an enemy alien in a detention camp in Canada. He was eventually released because, of course, using one's head, you would figure out that a German Jewish refugee is not your #1 source of pro-Nazi sentiment. And then he eventually joined the British military and eventually worked in intelligence with the War Crimes Commission. And he eventually found out that his entire family had been murdered in the Holocaust. So did I miss anything on that, Sarah?
Two things. He was the one who discovered, you say it at the end of this, but he was the one who just discovered
Right.
von Ribbentrop in hiding. Also, Martin Donald and the woman who became his wife, Anne Donald, went on to have 2 lovely children. One became a lawyer, and the other one, Florence Shapiro, became a state senator and a Plano mayor, and also at one point the chairman of this museum. So again, it brings home that surviving leads to, you know, all of these other developments.
Yes, thank you. We have a decent number of immediate post-war wedding photographs, both from inside DP camps. Lots of survivors got married in DP camps. Many of them were in DP camps for up to 5 or 6 years, started having children in DP camps as a way of rebuilding their lives. And then, of course, many liberators got married immediately post-war. This is an interesting story. The Isingers, this is their wedding photograph. Their parents died, and here it says about 100 relatives died in the Holocaust. Joseph Isinger was in the army at the time of liberation, and he had immigrated to the US via Belgium. And then they went on to be founding members of a synagogue here and important members of the community. So it's just, you know, when you think about weddings, births, rebuilding, and these again are featured in our museum and our liberation mural. This is an interesting photo that I had not seen before, and Sarah and I were fortunate enough to visit Buchenwald, and so this scene actually reminded me of what we saw in Buchenwald, the layout, the buildings, even though many of the buildings were destroyed, and then just the sheer number of GIs walking through the alley here really struck me. So these are GIs liberating Buchenwald, and the inscription on the reverse says, Buchenwald concentration camp, picture taken day after camp was liberated. Picture shows barracks the prisoners live in, 1,500 men to a single building. And we do see that a lot in testimony where they're just flabbergasted. The GIs are flabbergasted. I mean, a lot of these camps were former military barracks. So in that sense, it would have been recognizable. But when they look at a common barrack structure and realize that there's 10, 20 times the number of people crammed in there in horrible conditions, I think it really made an impact, because a lot of comments come out in testimony where they're saying, we couldn't believe how many people were in each barrack. We couldn't believe how many people were expected to be in each bunk. We couldn't believe the conditions. And of course, the more horrifying aspects of the smell, the stacks of bodies, the crematoria, and so on, of course, made an impact as well. Here's a letter in our collection, a handwritten letter sent home. One thing that strikes you right away is that it's been redacted and censored. The GIs, all their mail was getting read. I mean, it was well known. Now, this was both sides. I mean, the Allies and the Axis were heavily censoring letters to and from the front, mostly looking at information they didn't want to get out, including troop movements and other things like that that make a lot of sense. Unfortunately, we don't know what was redacted here and if it was pertaining to things he saw during liberating the camp, and he also liberated Buchenwald. There's two little excerpts I wanted to read to you from this letter. The first one, when I first got here in Germany, I sort of felt sorry for the German civilians, but now that I've seen this camp and heard the story of a fellow that was an inmate for 6 years, I know that the German civilian is as bad as the German soldier. So here, this GI is working through his expectations and understanding of the enemy, because I think it makes sense that if you're a soldier fighting Germany, you are going to think that the people trying to kill you are your enemy. And then, of course, you differentiate that from civilians. And, of course, historically, we know, of course, there were as many different ways of being a German as there are of being an American. So there were good Germans, evil Germans, there were Nazis, resistors to Nazis, all of that was represented in that population. But here he is working through that process and his understanding. And then I thought this was interesting. There's an excerpt that says, this letter may be a little on the blue side, but just forget about that for now. When you read this, I'll be over it. So he's saying, I'm pretty bummed out, but don't worry, I'll get over it. A little bit of the characteristic, or at least in my experience, of that time, whereas they're saying, this was pretty hard, but I'll buck up, you know, pull myself up by the bootstraps and I'll move on and get over it. Now, we've seen that sometimes was true and sometimes wasn't. Some of these guys didn't get over it. Some of them put it in its place, closed the door on it, and moved on. Did I miss anything on that one, Sarah? Okay. This is actually, I put this in there because it's one of the most common artifacts we get donated, actually. It's a memento or souvenir book about Dachau. It was produced, it's from 1945, but there's quite a few of them out there. And just to show you, it's what you would think of as a tourist souvenir in a way, and that was fairly common. This is not as common. This is, we have a couple of different versions of this from different camps, but this is a crematorium marker from Weimar, which really means Buchenwald, but this one is inscribed with an individual name and dates. And it was picked up by a GI in Buchenwald. So Buchenwald is right near Weimar in Germany. Don't try to get lunch in Weimar if you don't have euros with you. That's a side note from Sarah, Annie, and Addie and I, who managed to get in some mild trouble in Weimar. This is one of our biggest and most impactful liberation artifacts in the core exhibit at the museum. This flag was torn down by the 36th Infantry Division, which is the Texas Division. You can always tell this division from others because they have the little spade insignia. In fact, I saw a young lady, a GI in Target, who had this on her jacket, and I almost ran up to her to talk to her all about the 36th Texas Infantry Division, and then decided she may not want to hear that from me while she's getting her groceries. But this was torn down during the battle for Salerno. So first boots on the ground in the European theater were actually in Italy. We think of D-Day and Normandy and all of that, but there had been intense fighting up the boot in Italy in 1943, well before D-Day. And so this flag was taken down during those battles. And then the GI tore it down, their transportation unit inscribed it. So all of these are the people in the unit, and they each wrote it. And then some of them wrote inscriptions on here. And this little letter here from the donor is to his wife saying, "Every flag we tear down brings us closer home to you," which is really, I mean, it gets right to the heart of it, right? These guys are fighting evil. They're trying to get home to their wives and families. They're trying to, in their minds, and the world from peril. Let's take a moment. We're running a little short on time, but we're actually installing a large exhibit in the lobby about this liberator. His name was Rick Kramer. He was a photographer who worked as a medic and x-ray technician in the 45th Evacuation Hospital, which ended up encamped outside of Buchenwald for about 6 months. And he saw a lot of the atrocities of the concentration camps right up close and personal, and he documented it with his photography as well. So just in brief, he had a little, he was fortunate because he had a little leeway. A lot of GIs were moving quick on foot or in transport trucks. He was able to have a photography studio on wheels. He worked as a medic unit, and they had more flexibility with transportation and so on. So this is his little transportation truck, I mean, his little photography studio on wheels. And then his work as a medic, we have some really cool artifacts. This, of course, is a, what's the word?
Microscope.
Microscope. Goodness.
That technical term.
Yeah. If I can't get that, there's problems. And then here's he donated a selection of really interesting 1930s and 40s cameras. So this is a really cool little camera. And here's a picture of him inside his little mobile studio. He's slicing up some negatives here. It's pretty interesting stuff. The next liberator I want to quickly highlight is Colonel, and he was active in the Dachau trial. He was a lawyer from Dallas. And he spent a lot of his time working as a judge or a judicial official for the U.S. Army during the Dachau trial. Do you want to talk about the Dachau trial briefly, Sarah?
Yeah, sure. So the Dachau trials, plural, were a series of military trials that were conducted at Dachau for concentration camp guards, medical personnel, SS unit members, German civilians indicted for war crimes. And they were held between 45 and 47. They were held at Dachau simply because Dachau had the facilities that were adequate enough to be able to house both our own teams and to incarcerate these people. Ultimately, there were somewhere between 465 and slightly less than that trials. Different sources that I've looked at give you different numbers of the total number of trials. People were tried in a number of different categories, but they were basically tried for violations of laws and usages of war. So these were not trials for crimes against humanity or any of those things, what we think of when we think of Nuremberg and the International Military Tribunal. These were lower level. The Allies were trying these people, and these were not individuals who were Germans who had committed crimes against Germans, because that was left to the German courts to prosecute. These trials included concentration camp crimes from Dachau, from Buchenwald, from Flossenburg, from Mauthausen, from Nordhausen, from Muhldorf, and even from the Hadamar mental hospital. So again, these were lower level functionaries for the most point, but there was a sense, which we have a tendency to forget because we focus exclusively we as Americans on the IMT trials. The Allies didn't let it go at that level. They went, they went considerably deeper in their efforts to bring justice / to punish, because that's what these particular trials were about. If you want additional information on this, there are all kinds of articles on the Dachau trials, plural. One of the very best sources, because it breaks them down trial by trial, and you can see actually what happened in the trials, is jewishvirtuallibrary.org. jewishvirtuallibrary.org, and that's where you can get additional information. These were all essentially military tribunals. These were not judge and jury, and so Colonel Ackerman was part of one of these tribunals.
And I'll just add to that that one of the goals of these trials was going after German atrocities against U.S. military. So mass, shooting GIs after capture rather than adhering to the Geneva Convention and things like that, which of course there were plenty of examples.
Malmedy massacre was
Right.
tried through one of these trials. Yeah, so yeah, that's absolutely right, Felicia.
And P.S. there were Ritchie boys who were murdered, there are 2 Ritchie boys who were murdered who I think they tried them the U.S. tried them and convicted them, right?
I mean, they literally pulled these 2 Ritchie boys in the midst of the Battle of the Bulge. They had captured some American troops. They pulled the 2 Jews who were Ritchie boys away. They marched the other American POWs off to a POW camp, and they shot the 2 Jewish Ritchie boys there in the field. And for that, the commanding officer of that unit was tried as part of these Dachau trials, and he was executed. Yeah.
So this is a photo of Colonel Ackerman. He's right here. Wait a minute, he's right here. I'm sorry, he's the second from the left. And then we have in our collection some documents. He hand calligraphied the list of trials, and pretty interesting little document that he put together. You can see how much he really cared about his efforts with the trial. And this in German says, wenn Sie auch wimmern, bleibt eisern und kalt, denkt an die Toten von Buchenwald. So when you're complaining, basically, remain of iron and steel, essentially, and think about the dead of Buchenwald. Really quickly, I want to show one of our most interesting artifacts. This, as some of you may know, Robert Etzel created the Monuments Men Foundation here in Dallas, and I hope many of you have seen the Monuments Men film with, the Hollywood elite, and they did a really good job, I think, of showing the efforts that the Monuments Men undertook. And that film is really focusing on the Monuments Men's efforts to repatriate art. So the Nazis were hoarding, stealing art from Jewish families, synagogues, other nationalities, other public and private libraries and art museums all over the Reich, and they stole it and hoarded it. And it seems a little counterintuitive because they were stealing just a ton of Jewish religious texts, Jewish religious artifacts, and you think, why, if you're going to hoard this material of a culture and a society and a religion that you're trying to destroy? But they intended to build a museum featuring these artifacts and rare books and religious texts. The Monuments Men movie focuses on the art they stole from, just museums, private collections, churches, synagogues from all over the Reich. But this artifact that I'm going to share with you focuses on the rare books and religious texts that were hoarded and stolen. So there was an intense effort, and I have a little bit of personal angst when I see these photos, because this is essentially the work that Robin and I do. Robin works with me at the museum on our artifact collections. And essentially, this is what we do at work all day. And so to see these photos of these gentlemen trying to untangle just an incredibly complex web of documents, and the goal was to return them to the owners. Now, some of the owners were dead because they've been murdered in the Holocaust. Some of these communities where these religious texts had been stolen had been wiped out. So there was a big problem. In fact, we have a Torah in the museum, in the memorial room, that was rescued in part of these efforts that had been stolen from a community that was decimated during the Holocaust, and so we gave it a new home. But they were trying to return these documents to the original owners, which is just an incredible process, especially when you see the scope. So quickly, here they are sorting books. Here's a huge truck full of books that have been located in one location, being unloaded. Significantly, these GIs are African-American gentlemen. I looked at this book a dozen times before I even noticed that. Here's just a sense of the scope. They're unloading a box car, like a train car, full of books that they found in a hoard. And here is a big long shot of just pallet after pallet of hundreds of thousands of rare books from all over Europe. I mean, that gives me just a ton of anxiety seeing that. We have 3,500 books in our library, and I have a mild ongoing anxiety about that. But when I see this, I thank my lucky stars. Here's another shot of those, and here below you can see they're trying to account for the percentage of languages, and of course the language problem was a big problem. So they recruited academics from the U.S. Armed Forces who had language ability to try to help decipher a lot of this. And here just finally is a huge palette of rescued Torah scrolls from communities all over Europe, and a lot of effort is still ongoing to find the appropriate home for some of these rescued Torahs. I think we are officially out of time. I just want to briefly share, we have a lot of artifacts and photos. This is Max Glauben, who was liberated and ran around Europe with some GIs for a while. Here he is again. A lot of efforts after the war to try to help the liberated, so the survivors of the Holocaust. So here's a Czechoslovak Jewish community pamphlet where they're trying to find help for people. And here, just as we close, this is a memorial put together by survivors of the Holocaust for the Holocaust. And these popped up all over Europe where they're memorializing their dead in real time, immediately after liberation. Okay, thank you so much. And please email us questions. I don't know if we have any, we've got about 5 minutes if there's anyone who wants to unmute themselves and ask a question now. Okie dokie. Well, do we want to wrap up? Annie, do you want to take us out, or Sarah?
Felicia, I actually had a question for you.
I'm so sorry.
Just in case people are still thinking. I don't know if you know the answer to this, but the Dachau book that you showed, that kind of almost souvenir booklet, was that created by the Allies, and who was the audience for that?
I don't know the exact answer to that, but things like that were often, I think that actually was kind of a mass-produced item available for sale. We do know for sure that GIs, including Richard Kramer, would create basically picture postcards of photos they took of the liberated camps and sell them mostly to their fellow GIs. That was the main audience for that. A lot of guys wanted proof of what they'd seen, and they acquired that proof. That guy who picked up an ashes marker, a crematorium marker, and took that home. I mean, it was meant to be, I was there, I saw this. And we do see kind of the same set of postcard print photos of camps that were liberated, brought to us by liberator families quite often. So that a lot of GIs purchase that sort of thing. Sarah, anything to add on that?
No, we didn't really talk about Richard Kramer relating to that kind of souvenir, for lack of a better word. But as part of the Rick Kramer collection, we have several small packets about this big, made out of a paper / wax paper, and in those packets he has, I never remember, it was 9, 10 photos, but it's of Buchenwald as he saw it, coming in as an army medic after the immediate liberation, but not that far after. It was D-Day plus a few days, because what his medical unit was doing, they were an early version of what we know of from the MASH television show, as a medevac unit, only they weren't called that at the time. So his unit was coming in to separate typhus patients in Buchenwald from the rest of the patients, because there was a fear, since everybody was so weak, that once typhus grabbed hold of this population, the entire population was going to be lost. So as he was helping to triage those typhus patients out of Buchenwald, he took a series of photos of stacks of bodies, and they were very neat and orderly stacks. That's how you know it wasn't the day of liberation, that, you know, that American troops had been there starting to
Yeah, he was D-Day plus 10.
Okay, D-Day plus 10. He then developed these photos in his Toot Sweet photography truck, the truck that we like to say liberated, and that's yet another meaning for the word liberation, because I'm sure the U.S. Army didn't say, here's a French truck, why don't you use this? Anyway, he developed them in his truck photography studio, and we found out a few years ago that he actually sold these little packets to GIs who were heading home, because he thought that they would value these packets more if they had to spend a few pennies or whatever on them. And these were meant, it came with a little kind of explanatory paragraph about the horrors of Nazi Germany, and that this is evidence that you're taking home with you. So again, always thinking about liberation and what they saw and what they experienced. It just doesn't leave them.
All right. Well, I think we're about wrapped up for today. Thank you to Felicia and Sarah for leading the charge on today's Lunch and Learn. Thank you all for joining us. A big thank you again to our community partners for today. And as always, you're welcome to visit our website, dhhrm.org, for all of our upcoming programs. We hope to see you soon.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.